I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine the Latest. Today, as Moldova resists alleged Russian meddling in the weekend's presidential vote, we hear how Moscow may be attaching thermobaric warheads to its Shahed drones.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 4th of November, 2 years and 260 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by senior foreign correspondent Roland Oliphant. I began with the latest news from the battlefield. Now, the weekend was characterised by waves of Russian drone attacks. Most were shot down. Many of the rest were brought down by electronic warfare. Some returned to Belarus and Russia. But some, and the numbers I'm talking about, that means many, did get through, leading to casualties across the whole country, but essentially mainly from an arc from the north in, say, the Sumy Oblast, round through the east, from Kharkiv and Donetsk down to the south, and Zaporizhia and Kherson. Now, to give you some kind of idea of the scale of this constant bombardment, let's take a snapshot on the drones. So drones fired by Russia at Ukraine. Last night, 80. Saturday night, 96. Friday night, 71. So that's 247 drones, Shahed and others, mainly Shahed, but 247 drones launched by Russia at Ukraine since our last podcast on Friday. Thanks as ever to journalist and documentary maker Tim White for his constant reporting from Ukraine. It's worth pointing out, actually, as Tim does, that Russia's assault on Ukrainian civilians, what I'm talking about here, is very, very drone heavy. There are very few missiles, although an Iskander-M did hit Dnipro last night. But generally, very few missiles, mostly drones, and lots of them. Now, that might suggest Russia is short of ballistic missiles. It might suggest they're saving them up for a winter offensive on the energy infrastructure, for example. We don't know. But it is exceptionally heavy aerial bombardment by drones at the moment. Now, last night, as I said, 71 drones fired. A supermarket and apartment buildings were hit in Kharkiv, 15 injured there. Rescue operations are ongoing. Yeah, that's a supermarket, a global superpower attacking a local supermarket. On Saturday, General Alexander Syrsky, the head of Ukraine's armed forces, said that Kyiv's troops are holding back one of Russia's, in his words, quote, most powerful offensives since the start of the full-scale invasion. After meeting a delegation of the Czech armed forces, General Syrsky described the situation on the battlefield as difficult. A bit of an understatement, I think. He said active hostilities that continue in certain areas require constant renewal of the resources of Ukrainian units. That constant renewal is a problem at the moment, as we've been reporting. Now, Russia generally continues to press forward on its offensives on the Eastern Front, primarily in the areas of Toretsk, Kharkiv, Pokrovsk. That's all in Donetsk area. Very little gain. Only really in the last few days on the northern side of the Kharkivsky reservoir, so about 20 k's west of Donetsk city. There's a large body of water there, and that was forming a natural obstacle between the left flank of the bulge, Russian bulge coming out of Donetsk city aimed at Pokrovsk. Now, as we've been saying in recent weeks, they're not able to go directly at. Ukraine has been very efficient and successful in setting up a kind of defensive shoulder there, but what that's forced the Russians to do is to kind of blob out the edges of that. So in the north, that's where Toretsk and Chasiv Yar are being hit. And then on the sort of left flank of that, the southern flank of that bulge, that's heading down towards the Kharkivsky reservoir, which any Ukrainian units in there risked being encircled. So I think they've withdrawn. Hence, there's a bit more speed of the Russian advance there, sort of filling in that natural gap. Anyway, that's about it for the actual sort of movement on the front lines, but there's been quite a lot on the diplomatic front over the last few days. Let's try and work backwards if we can. So today, right now, German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, she's in Kyiv. She arrived this morning, her 8th visit to Ukraine. In a very long statement that I didn't really have time to read it all. I'm sorry, Ms. Baerbock, TLDR. But she did say, we are countering this brutality with our humanity and support so that Ukrainians can not only survive the winter, but so that their country can survive. She reiterated, so I don't think it's new money, but she reiterated that Berlin has committed 170, an additional, on top of what they've already done, to be fair, an additional 170 million euros, that's about 185 million US dollars, to boost Ukraine's energy infrastructure ahead of this winter. She did finish this very long statement by saying that Germany was going to support the Ukrainian people for as long as they need. No, so this caught my eye because, my aversion to the phrase "for as long as it takes," it brings me out in hives. Anyway, so this caught my eye, and I thought I was just winding up for a good old Berlin bashing, but no need. She said Berlin was going to support the Ukrainian people for as long as they need us so that they can find their way to a just peace. Which is about, that's pretty good. That's not too bad. So I was feeling very warm towards Berlin and all things curry-versed. But I then saw Hans von der Burchard's report. He's the senior politics reporter for Politico Europe. Mark Rutte's gone to Berlin. Olaf Scholz has welcomed him to Berlin. They've been discussing a number of things. But regarding NATO membership, it's reported that Olaf Scholz opined that Ukraine should take a neutral status like Finland had for decades. Now, as Hans von der Burchard says, the Finland idea, this is his words, I quote, the Finland idea has an obvious flaw. Helsinki just dropped its decades-long neutrality and joined NATO because Putin's Russia is so dangerous and violates international law. Ukraine even argues that Merkel, opposing Kyiv's NATO membership in 2008, led to today's war. Notably, Finland's ambassador in Berlin, Kai Sauer, speaks up to oppose the idea. It is not in our interest to restore any artificial spheres of interest, he told me. He told Mr. von der Burchard. We are obliged to respect the freedom of choice of Ukraine as well as its territorial integrity. So if you've got Annalena Baerbock, Germany's foreign minister, in Kyiv, giving it the big licks about lots of support towards a just peace, at the same time as Olaf Scholz is talking about some kind of the Finland idea, I thought had died a death when Finland joined NATO. But if this idea of some kind of neutrality, as if that's going to cut any dice at all with Putin, I'm just amazed. And I've no reason to, he's a seasoned journalist, Hans von der Burchard, I've no reason to doubt his reporting. But let's wait to see for the actual comments from that meeting with Mark Rutte and Olaf Scholz. Any talk of Finland, neutrality and what have you, just extraordinary. And if anybody's found Mr. Scholz's Zeitenwende lying around the floor, please pick it up and post it back to Berlin. It keeps wandering all over the place. Fick mein alte Stiefel. Right, next one. President Zelensky has called over the weekend for a tightening of the sanctions regime, saying Russia is still using Western components in drones and missiles. He said that in October alone, over 2,000 Shaheeds were launched against Ukraine. Bearing in mind, I've just said 247 were launched over the weekend. So very easily that number, 2,000 in October. And Mr. Zelensky says that would require over 170,000 individual components that should have been blocked from reaching Russia. Now, continuing this theme of military equipment, Radoslaw Sikorski, who's Poland's foreign minister, he gave an interview to Polsat News, that's a Polish TV channel and media organisation, over the weekend, in which he said Poland would allow Ukraine to buy weapons from Poland on credit. Now, I thought that was quite an interesting idea. It's hopefully quick, and if it's not quick, it's certainly easy or easier, an easier way to get very modern equipment into Ukraine in a fairly sharp manner. Now, buying it on credit on the never is not always a good thing unless that cash that you eventually use to pay for it comes from, let's say, frozen Russian assets. So that might work. However, Mr. Sikorski did not give any comment on policy limitations, potentially, and about where the weapons could be used. This idea, this long-running idea of where can Western weapons be used? Can they be used far inside Russia? Now, I'm not suggesting he tried to dodge the question. From what I can read of Polsat News, I don't think he was asked. The journalist didn't follow that up with what about the policy permissions? I've been trying to ring the Polish embassy here, or I have been ringing the Polish embassy here in London all morning, trying to speak to their political section, and they just keep hanging up on me. I don't think they're hanging up, to be fair. I think after I've pressed 1 and then 2 and then 1 and God knows whatever else I have to do, it just all dies, or one of us loses interest in the conversation. Anyway, I will continue to try to ask Polish authorities whether that plan comes with policy permissions. Now, Speaking about the aid for Ukraine, Mr. Sikorski said that his government had introduced a proposal for a defence loan. It could have been done from the beginning. Go ahead, buy from Polish factories on credit, and when you rebuild, you will pay back. So, yeah, quite a good idea. Let's have a look at that. Now then, connected on potential future supplies of military hardware, Josep Borrell, the top EU diplomat, over the weekend, he visited South Korea. He was in South Korea yesterday. Of course, this is of interest not only because he's the top dog in the EU on the foreign policy front, but also of North Korean troops joining the war. Now, after meeting South Korean Defence Minister Kim Yong-hyun, Mr. Borrell said on Twitter, Russia's aggression against Ukraine is an existential threat. The Republic of Korea is best positioned to understand it. We are united in our support to Ukraine. I encourage them to step it up. So there we go. We're talking about, will South Korea now take a firmer stance on Russia's war and the North Koreans about to join it? Very possibly, especially if they're being encouraged by the head of the EU diplomatic corps. Now then, as for those North Koreans, the first North Korean soldiers stationed in Russia's Kursk Oblast have come under fire. Andrei Kovalenko is saying this. He's the head of Ukraine's counter-disinformation department in Ukraine's National Security and Defence Council. He was speaking yesterday. God, a lot of stuff happened yesterday. Now, he gave no further details about where or when this contact apparently took place, but I just note, just so we're aware, because there's a lot of numbers flying around here, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said during a press conference last Thursday that around 8,000 North Korean troops have been deployed to Russia's Kursk Oblast. So you might hear different figures. We had General Budanov, the head of Ukraine's military intelligence, saying 12,000 North Korean soldiers had gone to Russia. I'm not saying that's not true, but you've now got Antony Blinken saying 8,000 are in Kursk Oblast. So they could both be true. But just so we're clear on the figures. All right, a couple more for me. I talked earlier about the huge amount of drones launched by Russia, generally at the moment, but particularly over the weekend. As I say, most have been brought down, but that may indicate an increased effort in the air as the ground movement slows down as winter approaches. Now, I note something today from the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War. They're reporting that the Russian opposition outlet Vazhniye Story, that means iStories, they cite numerous Russian mill bloggers complaining that the Russian military command is committing experienced drone operators to infantry assaults, resulting in high casualties amongst the drone operators. Now, some mill bloggers explain that the Russian military command prioritizes very heavy, very attritional infantry-led meat assaults, but lacks the necessary manpower. Some companies that should have, or maybe have around 90 people, are said to only contain about 20 regular infantry assault personnel, the others being made up of drone operators, comms specialists, cooks, bottle washers, all the rest of it. Now, ISW say that some Russian mill bloggers are suggesting that this comes from the Russian MOD's recent efforts to form what they call joint technical drone battalions and the Russian MOD's Rubicon Center for Prospective Unmanned Technologies. So they're suggesting Russian commanders, realizing that they're going to lose these drone operators anyway, are throwing them into meat assaults to see what they can get. But all that's doing is denuding, well, it's not achieving much on the ground, and it's denuding Russia of these more experienced drone operators. Interesting. Now, possibly connected to that, Russia is said to have fitted Shahed-type drones with thermobaric warheads. There was a Newsweek article published online on Saturday that reported that a team from the Kyiv Scientific Research Institute of Forensic Expertise wrote or produced a report on October the 29th that said after looking at the remnants of drones fired over what had been the previous 3 days to that, they had worked out that Russia had added thermobaric warheads to their drones. Now, the Kyiv Research Institute says the tactical purpose of these types of drones, because they're pretty dumb, they only go in one direction, they're not like first-person view drones that can pick a target. They're fairly governed by physics, launch, point, aim, and off it goes. The tactical purpose, therefore, is just to inflict terror rather than to achieve anything more precise. And the adding of thermobaric warheads to them will only increase that fear. Just so we're all aware, warhead is essentially a fuel-air explosive. So there's an initial blast that sort of scatters fuel in very fine particles over a large area, and then a moment later that is ignited, and it increases the effect of the blast. And in particular, it uses up all the oxygen you need. What do you need for a blast? Fuel, heat, and ignition. And so it takes all the air out. So it's a particularly devastating blast. It creates a tremendous overpressure, so it can collapse buildings by blowing out walls well away from the point of the actual impact of the munition, and the effect on humans is absolutely horrific. The overpressure can rupture internal organs and all that kind of stuff well away from the blast site itself if you're around corners and all the rest of it. So thermobaric weapons are especially nasty, and if they're now being added to Shahed drones, that's not great. Now then, just one more for me. I note, and this would link to Roland's first story. So Roland, here's your 1 minute warning. Start waking up. US intelligence agencies say Russian influence actors are behind a suspected fake video of a Haitian man who claims to have voted multiple times in Georgia as part of the US general election process. Obviously, the main election itself tomorrow, but there has been, I think, 75 million already voted in the general election. Now, this 20-second video, which has been viewed hundreds of thousands of times on Twitter and other social networks, shows two men in a car claiming to be Haitian. One says that they obtained US citizenship within 6 months of arriving, and they've both voted for Kamala Harris in Gwinnett and Fulton counties in Georgia. They're encouraging other Haitians to come join the United States. Now, I saw this on the BBC. They said, with their BBC Verify team, they said they found clear indications that it included clear indications that it had been falsified. There were false addresses, stock photos. They say it's a fake video. In a statement, 3 US security agencies said that the video, quote, falsely depicted individuals claiming to be from Haiti and was made by Russian influence actors. A joint statement from the FBI, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency said this Russian activity is part of Moscow's broader effort to raise unfounded questions about the integrity of the US election and stoke divisions among Americans. The Russian embassy in the US said the accusations were baseless, and they said Russia, quote, has not and does not interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. Right, so just so that's clear. But they were not the only allegations of Russian meddling in electoral processes, elections, over the weekend. Roland, you've been looking at this second round of voting in Moldova's presidential election that took place yesterday. Could you give us a brief recap of this election and then what happened when the results last night?
Yes, absolutely. So, presidential election, which actually coincided with a referendum on whether or not to make seeking European Union membership, to write that into the constitution, which passed very narrowly a couple of weeks ago. But it was a shock because the polls beforehand had suggested that that would pass very well. And then Maya Sandu, the incumbent president, failed to take more than 50% of the vote and was forced into a second round runoff. And in the run-up to all of this, there was a hell of a lot of warnings and reporting. I mean, coming from the West as much as from Russia, actually, saying that this is a battleground. This is not just a local election in a relatively small European country. This is a choice about which way this country is going to go and essentially which camp that country might fall into in this great showdown between Russia and the collective West. Russian media was certainly accusing the West of doing whatever it could to interfere, and the West has accused Russia. Now, the runoff was yesterday. Maya Sandu did win, so by the time all votes were counted, she was on 55.41. Her rival, Alexander Stoyanoglu, who is supported by the pro-Russian socialists, he won 44.59, so 55-45 split, really. However, two things to highlight here, Dom. First of all is just how close it was, because the statistics show that actually Maya Sandu lost in the country itself. Her victory was secured by the votes from the diaspora. So lots and lots of Moldovans, lots of them in Europe, voting for her at embassies and consulates and other polling stations set up outside the country. So that really exposed that kind of central division in Moldovan society between a diaspora and also people living in the capital Chisinau, fairly pro-EU, and often a lot of poorer people in the more rural regions, maybe Russian-speaking regions of the country. It's a former Soviet republic where Romanian is the official language and the majority language, but a lot of people speak Russian there. And also in that pro-Russian separatist regions of Transnistria and Gagauzia, voted against. So a narrow result, but also really badly marred by exactly the kind of thing that you're talking about. First of all, let's start with the accusations about the voters overseas. So the Moldovan foreign ministry, but also the German government, have said, look, there were multiple bomb threats, apparently coordinated, called in to several of the polling stations in Germany, including Frankfurt, including in Berlin, and also here in the UK, in Liverpool and in, I believe, Nottingham, with the clear objective, prevent Moldovans voting abroad. And we had Stanislav Sekriu, the president's, Maia Sandu's national security advisor, saying that national voter record systems had been targeted by cyber attacks yesterday to disrupt links between the domestic polling stations and those abroad. And we've also got Moldovan police saying they've got reasonable evidence of organised transportation of voters. So that's illegal under Moldovan law. Under Moldovan law, you can't go out and herd a load of people into buses and say, come on, we're all going down to the polling station today. People are meant to do it of their own free will. They say that they've got evidence of it happening inside the country, and they haven't said who did that, but also that they're investigating and registering evidence in connection with air transport activities from Russia to Belarus, Azerbaijan and Turkey. So the implication is obviously that Russia was flying Moldovan citizens from Russia to Belarus, Azerbaijan and Turkey so they could vote, hopefully, presumably, assume they'd vote for the pro-Russian candidate in the overseas polling stations there. So if that is true, if that's what happened, it obviously hasn't worked. Maia Sandu won. There doesn't seem to be an attempt to overthrow the outcome of the election so far. So her rival, Mr. Stoyanoglu, he, while votes were still being counted, urged people to remain calm regardless of the figures. He hasn't spoken since, as far as I can aware, not since we'd come on air. But perhaps in slight contrast, perhaps even to what's happening in America this week, it doesn't seem like he's gone out of his way to create the conditions for some kind of challenge to this outcome on the streets. But definitely an election that is seen as heavily marred, certainly from Moldova and from Europe. Very, very detailed accusations of Russian attempts to sway that election the Kremlin's way.
Yeah, thanks, Roland. I mean, it's really interesting. I do hope that the world's attention doesn't move on completely. Of course, it's going to a certain extent tomorrow with the presidential election in the US. But if we've got very strong allegations here of Russian meddling in Moldova's election, plus what's happening in the Georgian election, then that shouldn't just be overlooked, even if the West, if you like, would say, oh, well, Maia Sandu won, that's great, let's all move on, let's get going. That's not helpful at all. This needs to be tracked down. I mean, the number of alleged bomb threats rung into polling stations around, as you say, for the diaspora that actually got her over the line, including one, I think, here in Liverpool in the UK.
So Liverpool and Northampton. So two in the UK, Dom, we've got reported bomb threats.
Right. Okay. Well, there you go. And they'll be up there. I know there are others across Europe. So, that's significant. I think it's very brave, very good that the election authorities decided to, whoever they were, as you say, it's in the consuls and what have you, but kept those stations open in the face of this. And, funny old thing, no bombs went off. So if it was a Russian attempt to disrupt the election, it didn't work and people stood tall and stared it down. That's good. But we can't just stare away from this. And so we will keep our eye on Moldova because it speaks of Russia's approach and Russia's attitude, if they are behind this, to this new foreign policy posture from the Kremlin since the start of the full-scale... Well, actually, it's not since the start then, of course, is it? But we will keep our eye on that. But we also do keep our eye on what's happening in Georgia. Now, we won't do a deep dive. We had a good old look at this last week. We will do so again. But there's the first organised protest, I believe, by the opposition tonight. They've called for a protest tonight. So this is where a lot of people have been thinking, well, is there going to be violence on the streets? Is it going to be a revolution? Or what's going to happen? Nothing's happened so far. Maybe they've missed their momentum, but tonight is the first, I believe, is this correct? The first organised protest that the opposition have called for. Is that correct, Roland?
There were protests last week, but yes, on Friday, three of the main Georgian opposition parties called for protests on Monday, so that's today. It's meant to start at 7 p.m. local time. It's their belief that the victory of the ruling party, Georgian Dream, was completely rigged. They've been backed up by... They're now able to look to an exit pollster saying that the discrepancy in results between the exit polls and those reported by the Central Election Commission could not be statistically explained. So they've got some ammunition there to throw around. And they seem to have decided that, look, the best strategy for now is going to be sustained protests, So Anna Dolidze of the Strong Georgia Opposition Bloc, speaking at a press conference for those three parties on Friday, just before the weekend, said, look, we'll gather on Monday at 7 p.m. and tell you there our plan of action in detail at home or abroad within the legal framework, peacefully, but via organisation with a concrete result, we will continue our protest. So just a reminder, Georgian Dream, who's not officially led by, but funded by and believed to be effectively controlled by the billionaire Bidzina Ivanishvili, won 54% of the vote in Saturday's election. But monitoring missions, including the OSCE, the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, talked about lots of quite severe allegations of voting violations. So this is setting up to look different outcome to Moldova. This is where the supposedly the more pro-Russian party seems to have won. They strongly deny, of course, any kind of wrongdoing. But yes, absolutely, this feeds into, we had protests earlier this year in Georgia against a so-called foreign agents law, which is pretty much copied and pasted from the Russian version, which is basically, long story short, too long didn't read, it is a law that is designed to intimidate and silence gradually opposition and dissent. The people who protested against that law very much see what happened in this election as a continuation of what they see as that Russian-backed attempt to displace, seize power, consolidate power, keep pro-European, pro-join the EU voices out of power. But as you say, Dom, unclear where it goes. Georgia did have a revolution called I believe the Rose Revolution back in about 2004. It has had peaceful changes of power brought about by street protests in the past. Whether this goes that way is the cliche, but I'm afraid it's true. Definitely too early to say. But yes, 7 p.m. Georgian time, we will start seeing presumably people on the streets. And I guess, to state the obvious, Dom, a lot will depend on how much support that gets. If you get a massive show of support on the streets of Tbilisi, then that will have an influence on what comes next. If it looks like there just isn't that much public support, that could send things in a different kind of direction.
Okay, let's go to final thoughts. Roland, it's just you today.
What an absolute honour. I think there's only one final thought today, which will probably be the final thought tomorrow, and it links into everything we were just talking about, election interference and so on. There is one election which starts tomorrow. A lot is riding on this. It's the mere fact that the American election was coming up has probably distorted political and diplomatic and even battlefield events in Ukraine and Russia, as it has certainly in the Middle East as well, which I was also reporting over the weekend. It is obviously, there's no point in trying to second guess the outcome, but a lot is riding on this, and a lot of it is actually slightly unknown. So just before the weekend, I was asked to look about at the fallout for this for Ukraine, but also for other countries around the world. Funny thing I found was that people watching Russia were saying, well, the Russian disinformation campaign is clearly, if you look at what they're doing, they're trying to attack Harris and they're trying to back Donald Trump. Weirdly, the people watching Iran were saying, well, the Iranian disinformation campaign, which is much smaller than the Russian one, doesn't really have the same kind of reach and impact, seems to be trying to hurt Trump and support Harris. There's weird kind of differences even between those supposed allies on that side of the war. Obvious, profound implications for Ukraine as well, depending on the outcome that we've talked about again and again and again over the past, well, probably actually over the past 2.5 years. So that is what I am going to be keeping my eyes on for the next 48 hours going forward, and it's probably going to occupy the rest of the week of reporting, really.
Thanks for coming in today. More from you later on this week, I've no doubt. But from everyone here at the Telegraph newspaper in London, I wish you a very good afternoon. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, Please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.